So I'll just wait for a second until people filter in. Or not. Or out. As the wise ones do. So this is, thank you everyone for coming. The subject is cross-border deals and mega projects. The case study a little bit is Gordie Howe, although, and everybody on the panel worked on the deal. And I'll introduce everyone in a minute, but you can also see who they are, and I know you all know who they are. The concept here is to look at Gordie Howe, to use it as a test case, but then to extrapolate and discuss what lessons were learned in the project that will be useful going forward in mega deals that present sort of multi-layered issues on a kind of unprecedented scale, which the international cross-border deals do. So to my immediate left is Andy Doctoroff, who was the senior advisor to Rick Snyder, with all things Michigan to do with the project. Nuria Haltiwanger is the CEO of ACS globally. Bryce Phillips, the CEO of the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority, and Tom Barlow is a partner at Fasken. And I'm Brian Kelsall, and I'm a partner at Fasken as well. So just a couple of words, and then we have a treat for you all. We're actually, you don't have to do anything in this seminar because we have a movie. So the concepts here are cross-border, mega project, and international. Cross-border is international. The Gordie Howe deal taught us all, as we went through it and learned, how complicated the issues become when you have two different jurisdictions with a lot of different stakeholders with different perspectives, different goals. And cross-border is a subject that's almost gaining its own kind of weight in the infrastructure world. It's not a new concept. There's all kinds of think tanks and cross-border institutes that study that from a policy perspective, but from an infra perspective, we're going to see more and more of it. There are talks of light rail projects between our countries, and lots of examples, port deals that cross borders, all kinds of things. So, you know, what can we learn from Gordie Howe? And what can we apply going forward is what we're going to talk about. But before we do, if you could roll our video, you can sit back and relax and watch the little expose on the project itself.
Welcome to the Gordie Howe International Bridge, the new gateway between Canada and the United States, and the longest cable-stayed bridge in North America. Bridging North America is excited to partner with the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority on this momentous infrastructure project, one that will not only contribute to the overall prosperity of the two countries, but will also provide long-term benefits to the local communities on both sides of the border. Bridging North America is composed of some of the world's largest and most successful international and local infrastructure developers who all bring their combined expertise to the Windsor-Detroit area. Bridging North America partners have built some of the most notable cable-stayed bridges around the world and some of the most complex infrastructure projects in Canada and the United States. Together, they will design, build, finance, operate, and maintain the Gordie Howe International Bridge project. With its 2.5 kilometers of length, 6 lanes, and a main span of 853 meters, the Gordie Howe International Bridge will be a state-of-the-art crossing that will provide an elegant, lasting, and iconic image which will form part of the future Windsor-Detroit skyline. Bridging North America's structural design achieves the highest standards of safety and long-lasting durability for the bridge. Its toll system solution will ensure continued performance and a smooth experience for future bridge users. The project includes the construction of 2 port of entry buildings to accommodate security and customs facilities on each side of the border. The buildings have been designed to be energy efficient and environmentally sustainable, and to provide for a safe, secure, and convenient border crossing. With the completion of the Michigan interchange, the project will create a streamlined corridor from the existing Right Honorable Herb Gray Parkway in Windsor to the Interstate Highway 75 in the surroundings of Detroit. Making a positive and lasting difference in the communities that will be served by the project is at the core of Bridging North America's values. Members of Windsor and Detroit local communities will benefit through numerous initiatives and through engagement with the thousands of workers who will be required to complete the construction works and perform future maintenance services. The Bridging North America partners have made a 36-year commitment to the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority and to the governments of Canada and Michigan. This public-private partnership combines the strength of the world's industry leaders with the strengths of the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority to create a unique landmark project that both countries will be proud of.
So I should say one thing before, lest you think we simply assembled up here, but we don't know anything about it. Obviously, Nuria representing Bridging North America, Andy, Michigan, Bryce, the WDBA, and Fasken, we acted for the Canadian federal government and Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority in the deal. So without any further ado, I will go to my first question. Nuria. Yeah. I think we all realize that there were perhaps more upfront issues on this deal than any of us thought, and perhaps more than any other deal we've seen. Things like land acquisition and environmental issues and things like that. To what degree did those requirements compel you to have to think outside the box? And to the extent you did think outside the box and came up with solutions, where do you see things that would apply not just to the unique elements of Gordie Howe, but going forward for other cross-border deals? And the rules are here, guys, before we get going, is Nuria's going to lead off. We've got a question for people, and then the panel's going to wade in.
So I think just in general, when we were approaching the project, we've had the benefit within ACS Group to twofold. One, we knew the area quite well, and we've been dreaming about this project going on for many years because we're involved with our partner Fluor in the Right Honorable Herb Gray Parkway, which is leading up to the project. So we've been seeing this and envisioning it for a very long time. I think the other sort of thing going into the project that we knew was ACS Group has done a number of projects internationally that are cross-border. And so up front, we sort of knew some of the issues that were probably going to come about. And so we started first in terms of teaming. So we needed to make sure, we looked at the project, we looked at the scope, which at the beginning was also somewhat changing and figuring out what the scope was going to be, and making sure that we teamed with the right partners and formed Bridging North America in a way that could address all of those different issues. I think the teaming was critical. We had an excellent partner in Fluor and an ACON who brought expertise along with ourselves. We each worked on both sides of the border. So we knew the different issues going in. We knew that there were going to be challenges that needed to be addressed, particularly more on the US side, given that this was being procured by the Canadian side. But we also knew some of the differences in the standards that would be applicable, and having the right team, having the right engineering team that also helped and knew and had worked on both sides of the border and knew how to address those issues, I think was critical at the outset for us to be able to put the right team together, to be able to bid it, and know how to analyze the risks. There were a number of bespoke risks that were associated with this project that you don't see in other procurements. And as much as possible, us trying to identify them and bring them to WDBA to try and see how we could work through them. Yeah.
What I'd add, and I'll turn to Andy next, and Sandy was the other half of the Canadian-American group that tried to put this together, and you talked a little bit about risk. We heard about that a little bit earlier today in one of the sessions, and it's how you quantify those risks and ones that can't be quantified, and how, as partnering, you can figure out how to share, you're going to take on those risks. That's a big piece that you don't see in a lot of the mega projects around the country. I'm relatively new to this whole project. I joined the Bridge Authority in July. But what I'm used to seeing is about 25% of the money of a project gets spent before you're actually into the main project. And for an international project, from what I could see, we did that plus more. And that's all that prep work to try to figure out how to get yourself ready so that you can be successful. And to the partnering piece, I mean, I think Mandy will add to that. I think you need to do a lot of work with your international partners to try to understand where they're coming from. You know, they're stakeholders and they have a different perspective, and how can you work with the different groups to try to find a solution to a lot of the challenges you run into.
Thank you. This really was, in every sense of the word, a project that was and is outside of the box. It's unprecedented. On the Michigan side alone, we have risks that Michigan had to learn and that Canada, our Canadian partners, didn't know a lot about. And the list is practically endless. We had 5 aggressive lawsuits that were filed by the owner of the Ambassador Bridge. We had to obtain 636 parcels of property under procedures that are very different from what the expropriation laws in Canada are. And we had to obtain them in a variety of different ways. Some of them were residential, some of them were occupied, some of them were commercial, some of them were industrial, some of them were owned by the city of Detroit. So we had that risk. We had environmental risks, the properties, many of which are contaminated. And we also, of course, have a very needy community. And that's just a small sampling of the risks and the challenges. So from my perspective, the key thing that I think was a lesson is how do we, Michigan, when we're not the jurisdiction that is financing this project, of course, communicate those risks to the Canadians, to the WDBA, to Transport Canada, and then the Infrastructure Ministry. And how do we not only let them know what those risks are, but how do we satisfy them that those risks are being mitigated? And that's an incredibly complex equation that we have to communicate. And what I'm proudest of in retrospect is that by hook or by crook, with certain very key personalities, like Tom Barlow and Brian and Tim Horner in our audience, and also certain key members of the WDBA as well, we were ultimately able to establish a framework of communication and trust. And I would make the argument that without those 2 twin virtues, communications and trust, this project would not be where it is today. And so in terms of going forward, I think the main lesson is how do we create in these multi-stakeholders, multi-jurisdictional projects, the infrastructure, no pun intended, that allows us to communicate as partners, to step inside the other person's shoes, to know what the issues are, the perspectives are, and then move forward, because we all had ultimately the same shared goal at the end.
Tom?
Thank you. Just picking up on some of that, and first of all, on your last comment, I'm minded of the minister's comments this morning.
Not a quote from Churchill?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet, later. The minister this morning said, think big. And that's very much what we had to do in the communication and in the analysis of the project, and everything from the very beginning was to think big in terms of how to bring everyone together in a shared mission to achieve a project that was very much in the national interest of Canada and also in the interest of Michigan and in the interest of the U.S. And we certainly were struck, we were involved in the project from almost 10 years, I guess, right to almost from the beginning, how everyone was committed, Andy, others, committed to bringing this to fruition in a way that didn't allow obstacles to get in the way of that objective, the big objective of getting the bridge done, setting up the communication mechanisms that are necessary to do that, but also then thinking outside the box in terms of the actual transaction. And coming back to the risk theme, you hear a lot about risk transfer at these P3 conferences, but we really did look afresh at risks that were, as you say, bespoke to the project. We were not confined to the templates, although we didn't want to build a camel. We wanted to have something that was recognizable to the market in terms of the project agreement and so on, but we were quite prepared to look at and dialogue with the private sector on these bespoke risks as to who best truly should bear it, and then adapt the language in the project agreement and in other facets to reflect that. And so if there's a lesson learned, in addition to the, think big and don't let obstacles get in the way that could very easily have been many reasons to not do this project, it would be, I think, that for risk analysis to go back to first principles when you're thinking about the project initially, think about the risks that may need to be reassessed, and then if you're on the authority side or if you're on the private sector side, frankly discuss why this project is different and why the template that may be suitable for another project needs to be modified in some way to adapt.
Yeah, and not to take over the questions, but just to give, I think, people a little bit of perspective, because we're talking vaguely about risks, but I think just to give you an example of what some of them are on this type of project that don't exist in other projects. So there's 2 jurisdictions, so there are conflicting design and construction codes. So we're having to design and construct a project that has to meet that. There's many stakeholders, which I think we'll get into in terms of how that worked and who they were. There is currency risk. So we're building some infrastructure, significant infrastructure on the US side. We're building significant infrastructure on the Canadian side. We're receiving payments, which then had to be discussed. So we're going to be building and we're going to have to be paying contractors and subcontractors in a certain currency. So there was a lot of discussion about how that should work or not work, because while you can maybe hedge, and we've done that internally, so our price includes us hedging that currency risk in the short term, there's really no products that exist that make any sense to try and do that in the long term. So it was a discussion on how payments should come in on the long term to sort of deal with the fact that there were going to be works that were going to happen during the rehab phase that are being performed in US currency, that are being performed in US dollar, while most of the payments were coming in Canadian dollar, and how we could address those risks. The contamination risk that was referenced, the legal framework is so different in how that risk is dealt with on the Canadian side versus the actual liabilities that can potentially attach under the US framework, which are much more stringent. And so being able to craft that and build that in. So there were so many of these different things, not to mention that in the middle of the process, there was a tax reform bill that happened in the US, and there's different tax treatments just to begin with. But most people aren't even actually aware of some of the things that were included in the tax reform bill that in some senses can negatively affect P3s and how they're treated if you're having to characterize it in a certain way. And even just understanding what the consequences of them were, because the regs hadn't even come out yet for that as we're bidding. And so all of those discussions and all of that analysis existed on this project that I think some people aren't even, so when we're talking about risk, I just wanted to put that out there about what some of them were, because we're sort of talking about them vaguely. And each one of them, I think, to your point, going and looking at them from a first principles perspective and looking at them from what makes sense for this project was so valuable and important.
So, and I would add to that, I mean, we can, if you want, we can go on and on. I mean, there were literally hundreds of them that presented different, required a solution that was different than what you'd consider to be the norm. What I'm hearing, if I can summarize, is proper teaming, getting to it very, very early, ideally having done it before, and bringing that experience. Communications and trust can't be sort of overemphasized. That was fundamental to it. And then being able to go and look at a problem from first principles and break it down and not necessarily go the path most trodden and come up with solutions, I think were kind of the summation of it all. I give you an example of that, and I'm going to add a word to that, and then we'll go on, and that's communication. We did, and I can't remember the exact number, but somewhere around 90 plus CCMs. Because we couldn't figure it out alone, and the private sector couldn't figure it out alone. So we needed to get our heads together, and that was recognized early. And without that kind of dialogue, which was cumbersome and lengthy, but it was worth it, because we came up with, for example, the currency and the hedging. Very good solutions, I think. So it was nobody sat and figured it out, and those CCMs were invaluable. So, of course, they represent communication.
And before you get to your next question, just on the communication, it's got to be recognized that the communication is not only structured. I personally think that some of the most valuable communication was completely improvisational, late at night, quiet phone calls, talks over lunch, someone calling you unexpectedly and saying, are you seeing this the same way I'm seeing this? Because this makes no sense. People were very humble in their appreciation as to what they didn't know, and they were very aggressive in terms of reaching out in all sorts of unorthodox and, again, trusting ways to expand that very well-developed network of communications that were both formal and informal at all times of the day and sometimes night. So it's very improvisational in that regard as well.
So I'm gonna move us on to the next question, lest we run out of time. All these questions are of a theme, but this one kind of bisects this thing this way. We discussed risks. Now I want to draw your attention to the fact that we, of course, had two G7 countries, one that was paying for the whole thing, one that wasn't, and so many different constituents, all interested in the project, all with their own goals for the project. So many different players, the border security people, the various municipal governments, the FHWA, Canadian federal government, Ontario government. So all of those things created if you look at it, a risk. You couldn't simply solve it simply. It had to then be cut into pieces and analyzed from all those different perspectives. So I'm going to throw this one to you, Tom, because you and I spent a lot of time doing this kind of thing. How did that, in your mind, cause us to depart from the regular P3 methodology? And if you can, try and draw some things out of the solutions that may apply going forward to other cross-border deals. This time from the how many people are involved perspective.
Yeah. I'll speak to that and certainly look to some of the solutions that we developed. But I think it's important to note that when we spoke with the private sector, we tried, after having all the discussions that I'll come to have a consolidated position rather than a position that was diverse among the various interests. So we certainly had very extensive communications internally, which I'll come to, but perhaps it's worth noting that we also thought it was an important principle that when we spoke with the proponents, we had a consolidated view that they could take to the bank, literally. And so all our consultations, some of them were more open with the proponents in the sense of the different perspectives, but ultimately we came to a view, and then we ran with it, and I think that was appreciated, so that there was some certainty and efficiency in the process. But in dealing with the private sector and dealing with the proponents, we did use some innovative tools that aren't common, like white papers and that sort of thing, to get their thoughts on a given topic to go outside the normal CCM process. So there has been some discussion at this conference about term sheets and other ways of having more dialogue. Some of that was pioneered here, which we can talk about in other contexts. Internally, in addition to the things that Andy has spoken to, in terms of structures, we set up structures that were, or WDBA set up structures that allowed for formal and informal communication, as you say, Andy. And we had task forces set up on all subjects to ensure that in all respects, the views of the Michigan and U.S. Parties were taken into account in making the decisions that needed to be made. Now, part of that was a legal necessity as well as a project necessity in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, because the project had to satisfy federal aid eligibility requirements, which required FHWA and MDOT to be involved appropriately, as they would be in one of their own projects in the project, at least to the extent required by the crossing agreement and by the parameters that were set out. But another big part of it was because of the way the WDBA wanted to manage the project and Michigan and all the players. And it made for a very collaborative approach at every step of the way. And so the Michigan people and the federal people on the U.S. side were not just involved in contributing to the decisions that were relevant to their jurisdiction, but in all the decisions related to the project, they were engaged. So lessons learned, certainly formal structures are important, informal structures are important. One other thing I think is worth saying, it's important to have a game plan, have a framework, have parameters before you go into a project like this, some policy markers, some principles that will guide. In our case, the government of Michigan and the government of Canada, which was supportive, both of which were so supportive throughout the whole process, had developed something called a crossing agreement, which was an agreement between the two jurisdictions that set out the basic rules of the project and the procurement. And some of those rules were extremely important to have as touchstones as we were going through the process, so we weren't making it up as we were going along. An example, it was decided in the crossing agreement as part of the negotiations back in the period when it was before it was signed in 2012, that a Canadian P3 model would be used for the transaction. So that was sort of a launching off point. We then, however, looked at all P3 precedents across North America and not just were confined to that and brought the best practices in, but the crossing agreement had that as a launching off point. It also set out some parameters in terms of what could be and could not be in the RFP and in the project agreement to ensure consultation and participation and other outcomes for the various parties. So I would say another important variable, and I've seen this in other P3s, is that if you don't, I think Yogi Berra, I'll quote him, said that if you don't know where you're going, you're not going to know if you got there. And this project began with some fairly robust parameters within which we then operated, and when issues came up, they were referenced as part of the framework that everyone began with, and that helped, as opposed to making it up every step of the way.
Yeah, I think what you touched on, Tom, the crossing agreement and then the international authority that was established out of that, and that's crucial for projects that are international in nature. And if you think about that, back 5 years ago, 4 years ago, the project achieved a waiver, a presidential permit waive to Buy America requirement. So, there have been changes since that permit was issued. So if you don't have very strong relationships with your international partners to deal with all the things that change over time on the political level, then you find yourself in a pickle, I think, where you probably could not get to a point where you have a procurement in place. So I think that piece on the crossing agreement, international authority that has members on both sides of Canada and the U.S., and those folks can help you a lot with the relationships that you have on both sides of the border to deal with everything that comes up in that long process from the initial agreement to when you actually get to financial close.
I'd like to add something about the crossing agreement. It really was a godsend. And sometimes we didn't think of it that way. The crossing agreement was a binding contract. It is a binding contract. but it was written at a time when people had very little understanding of how the project would unfold. And the beauty of the crossing agreement, in my mind, is that it gave us sufficient flexibility to improvise when we needed to. However, on key points, they were, inviolate. You could not and would not stray from them, nor did Canada allow us to do so, even if we were inclined to ask them to do so. And in retrospect, that was a project benefit because it, as Tom is suggesting, as well as Bryce, it gave us a roadmap, and it made the rules of the road apparent for most of the big issues. Not all of them, because the crossing agreement, like any contract, had some ambiguities, had some empty spaces, if you will, so that we had to operationalize it. But if you're talking about going forward rules, when you're talking about international projects with multi-stakeholders, getting that framework agreement such that is one that is intelligently negotiated and equitable is critical, because you're going to want to live by it, but at the same time, it has to be able to breathe so that your hands aren't tied and you're immobilized when unexpected issues arise. I could go into some of the unexpected issues, but I won't because of time, but there were many, and the beauty of that crossing agreement is that we were able to do things that were creative within that framework.
And I think from the private perspective, for us as the potential developers at the time and now developers of the project who are going to be designing, building it, we financed it, now we're going to operate and maintain it going forward as well. It was really important for us to know we had a client. Who was our client? Who were we? We needed to talk with one entity who helped manage and run not just the process, but the contract itself on a go-forward basis, because there were so many stakeholders. I think we've referenced them, but I mean, so many. Not just the federal government of Canada and the state of Michigan, but the city of Detroit, the city of Windsor, the different border agencies, just so many. And I think it should be commended to you guys and to the WDBA staff and everyone for the ability to have been able to really consolidate positions and get together and find those solutions. And for us, the crossing agreement was important to know that it existed, that it was there, what it helped establish, because as we were walking through, and not to bring this back to the first question, but as we were looking at some of the risks and we were talking and analyzing how things would be dealt with on a go-forward basis, it was important for us to know that some of those important frameworks had been set forth, because that's how we knew we were going to be able to get to a successful process. And what I think really drove it, and what will continue and what will be necessary to drive this project through the design phase, through the construction phase, into operations, is the fact that there was teams at all the different levels of the stakeholders who were actually working to try and find solutions to bring the project forward, because it was so important for everyone involved. And I think it was I think one of the most complex projects, I've said it numerous times, that we've ever encountered, and they're all complex and they're all difficult in different ways, but the procuring, the WDBA and their advisors and the state of Michigan, everyone should be commended for being able to get this project to where it is at this point and on a go-forward basis. And I feel that being on the private partner side, we take a lot of comfort, and we took a lot of comfort during the procurement as different issues were arising, even within the news and how is it all going to impact. We took a lot of comfort in knowing that solid base was there.
So that's interesting. I mean, we did take the decision early on, as Tom said, to take a lot of that in-house and try, as you say, Nuria, because it was obvious that you needed to have this, to have a consolidated position. But the one tragedy of that process is that if I see another Gantt chart, I'm going to run from the room. Because we had committees and task forces and I think rightly, representing Michigan and all of these various stakeholders that we're speaking of on virtually all of these issues, and that sounds awfully cumbersome, but in hindsight, it wasn't. I mean, it was cumbersome, but it was the only way to distill that funnel of stuff down to something that we could be confident to take to Nuria's team and say, you know, we've gone as far as we can go with this. This is the view of the procurement authority on this particular point. That process didn't come quickly or arbitrarily. It came from those horrible Gantt charts and trickling these issues down through the subcommittees. Drove us all crazy, but it got to the right result, I think is a fair statement.
I think it's probably also important to note that no one, WDBA or Michigan or anyone else, Canada, forgot the fact that there was a constituency outside of the project throughout that needed to be brought along and kept informed and so on. Sometimes with P3 projects, too much focus goes into the inside baseball, and certainly we could have gone that way, but there was a great effort to reach out to the community, certainly in Michigan and certainly in Windsor, and there was an Indigenous community involved. All of that, the WDBA and Canada and Michigan are to be commended for the degree of outreach throughout the process that they did at every step of the way to make sure that the project had the support it needed, but also to make sure that all these issues that we were facing did not absorb, you know, all our time and take our eye off the ball, that this is about the, you know, the community and service and serving the broader community and developing something that they will see value in. And I certainly know how much effort went into that, Andy, on your side of the border in terms of community benefits and so on. And
Hey, that's
and
the next
also,
question. We can't.
and also, well, that's
Perfect
what they
segue.
call a segue.
Segue.
Right. Moving on then
To the next question.
to the next question. Community benefits. There were some, you can imagine, with all those different stakeholders. And I'll put this one to you, Andy. So community benefits were a huge part of this. There were so many people, as I say, with so many different perspectives and so many goals at all levels. Community benefits touched all of it. Andy, I don't really have a question so much as to say, how did that happen that we were able to identify, consolidate, and move forward a body of community benefits when effectively you had two sides of a river? One side had their, you know, they wanted their community benefits to work, and you had a completely different country with a completely different set of criteria and one project that had to cope with all of that. And how did you balance those interests so that we were able to move that forward? Because, you know, a lot of the community benefits discussion was really between Michigan and Canada in that regard.
I personally, right now just speaking for myself, looked at community benefits as a moral imperative and a practical project need. And there was an intersection that made a certain type of deliverable absolutely critical. From a moral point of view, I joined the project right after I got finished reading this book, The Power Broker by Robert Caro, about Robert Moses. And I remember vividly reading that book and just recognizing if the community is not respected, if its interests are not taken to heart and addressed in a humane way, that affects the viability of projects, the longevity of projects, and also the moral integrity of a project. And so I personally never lost sight of that and was always very vigorous when it came to doing what I thought reasonably should be done to protect the interests of the community. But from a practical point of view that rises beyond the issue or extends beyond the issue of morality, we could not have done this project without community benefits because we had to obtain properties that were owned by the city of Detroit, 20 of them. And the politics of the city of Detroit are, you know, quite interesting, but the opponents of the bridge, the Maroons, Detroit International Bridge Company, have strong political ties to the city commission, to the city council and to the mayor's office. And had we not been thinking all the time about what we could do when it comes to community benefits, both in deals with the city of Detroit and in the community benefits plan that are reflected and incorporated into the project agreement, we would not have the properties we need to move forward with this project. And a critical part of the communications, going back to that theme, was convincing our partners in Canada what those dynamics were and how we had to deliver on community benefits. And, you know, the great thing is Canada listened, but the other great thing is that the community listened. Because there are certain things that we could not do when it comes to certain requested community benefits. And I won't list them here, but they were just non-starters. And we had to explain to them why we can't do this. But the good news is that everyone did listen. And I will have no tolerance for people who dismiss the concerns of the community simply by saying they want, you know, ponies, or they want merry-go-rounds, things that should not be given. Because some people who are associated with certain aspects of the project began to think, hey, we're creating jobs, they should be lucky, they should be thankful that we're there, end of story. And fortunately, we were all able to overcome that type of attitude and come to a reasonable middle ground where I think most stakeholders are very comfortable with where we are, that everyone has been treated equitably and everyone has honored obligations that I think we have as a project. So I look at community benefits with all of the interaction that we did with the WDBA. I mean, the WDBA was there every step of the way to understand what the needs and requests of the communities were. We arrived at a place where we can say this is a job well done. There may have to be refinements, don't know, hope not. But the fact of the matter is, given where we started and where we ended up, it's a huge project success and one that made the project possible.
Yeah, I would say from the private side, one of the, and I think just the idea and the focus on community benefits is something that on the private side, we need to understand and be more sensitive to overall on every project that we're doing. Because ultimately, that is how infrastructure can be built. That is how you can have the right buy-in that you need to be able to bring a project out to begin with, to make sure that the government authority has the funding it needs. And we're seeing it more and more as communities. I think it was even mentioned this morning. We're seeing, you know, referenda that are happening where people are agreeing to pay more for certain assets because they're starting to see those connections more directly. And I think we have to do a better job on the private side to bring those out. Here it was such a focus, and it was incorporated into the project agreement. And so it forced us as well to put together a comprehensive community benefits plan that we ended up including as part of our bid, and which was, I think, you know, we're very proud of and quite robust, and includes, you know, $250 million that will be going to local Canadian workforce, the local Canadian Indigenous population. It will go to the disadvantaged business entities on the U.S. side, and it will be focused in that, and it will be focused on educational opportunities, and it will be, so it forced us to have to develop that as part of our bid, and it's now incorporated into the project agreement, and now it is a long-term commitment that we have made and is a contractual obligation. So I think it was critical, clearly, to be able to bring the project forward, but I think it's just something in terms of lessons learned. I think it's something that we just should always be thinking about, and it's not just an obligation to be thinking about on the public side. It has to be an obligation as well for us on the private side to be making sure that the projects that we are developing and that our involvement are helping communities and are sustainable and actually contributing to the betterment of the communities that will be experiencing the infrastructure.
Bryce, any thoughts?
I think Nuria said it very well. I was going to add that based on what Andy was sharing with us, which is bang on. It drives the organizations to spend a lot of time paying attention to what the communities have to say. And I think on both sides of the border, that was done very well. And the outcome of that, as Nuria says, it becomes part of the contract. So now it's a deliverable. So I think that's the full circle of, you know, it's a political issue if you're not paying attention. And to solve that is to listen, do a lot of communication with the communities, and then build it into the contract you have with your project company.
I mean, I'd say one other thing on the lesson learned for the community benefits was that it wasn't an afterthought. It was at the very beginning of this project. At the first days that we were doing this, it was made an imperative on both sides of the border. So we all knew that and had to deal with it and make sure that it was properly reflected all the way along. People bought into it, and it was early on recognized that without it, as Andy said and Nuria said, there's no project. So let's move on. We're running out of time. I don't exactly know how much time we've got because we started a little late, but the clock says we've got 3 minutes and 41 seconds. So the future, what's that?
I think that's before the question.
I do too, yes, yeah. Just looking forward to the future, and I'm going to direct this first to you, Bryce. We're at this milestone, an incredible milestone for all of us. But now the bridge has to be built, and
That's the easy part, right?
all this stuff has to get done. So there will be challenges for sure. Bryce, you know, what keeps you up at night? What are the challenges you see going forward, and how do you see us all coping with that? And to the extent you can, what comes out of that thought that is applicable to the subject more generally?
Yeah, what keeps me up at night? Good way to portray it.
To do with the bridge, I meant.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's what I meant. I think the biggest challenge we're going to face is the cultures and relationship we set up between the two partners. I think it's going to be crucial for success that the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority and Bridging North America develop a very good collaborative relationship and have a similar culture, and they're trying to get to the same end goal. And if you don't do that, then you can end up in a situation where it's win at all costs. And if one of the two partners takes that stance, then yeah, you may win in court, but you don't get a bridge. So what keeps me awake at night is the effort we're going to put in getting, you know, the two boards right on down to the working staff, get the right culture and get that collaborative relationship where we can deal with all the challenges. And one thing I've told my staff with the projects, there's always problems. Right? If I go to a project meeting and it's just, yep, everything's good here, everything's good there, nothing to see, keep moving, that's when I know you're in big, big trouble. So I want to hear all the problems again on top of the table, because that's how the team solve it. And it's going to be a team effort to be successful. So the effort that I'm going to be putting into that opportunity is to build that culture between the two organizations where it's a win-win.
I think
Nuria, yeah.
there's a lot that keeps me up at night. 'Cause
Yeah.
Now is
Again, to do with the bridge.
yeah,
I mean,
exactly. Well, to do with the bridge, because now comes, I don't know, I don't like to call it the hard part, I always call it the fun part, but now we have to build it. Now we have to make sure that, you know, the things that we're focused on right now are, and we've already started to do that, so early mobilization. So we have teams that are already there, that are starting to work, that are getting incorporated, that are going to be working hand in hand. One of the benefits of this project was, you know, the technical solution had to be very defined because there were different ways you could approach the bridge specifically. So we advanced, you know, significant portions of the concept on the design, but now you're getting to final design approvals. And again, that's exactly correct. Things always come up. If you think that you've designed the thing before you've gotten actually fully on site, you haven't. So it's being able to make sure that we're able to create that, that communication that's been discussed. And I think one of the things that worries us, and we just want to make sure that it continues, is, you know, our connection and our client is the WDBA, but we're still aware of all the different stakeholders that are behind there. There, throughout the process, it was a very robust process, and, many of the one-on-one meetings, there was those stakeholders participated directly, so there was that good communication. Making sure that we're able to establish working groups at the project level that still incorporates that, so there can be direct feedback, but also in the end, it's going to still, we are still going to have to rely on the hard work that the WDBA is going to have to do in terms of coordinating the interests and working, and that goal, that shared goal that was clear, that got us to the point from all the different governments working towards this. We're still going to have that because issues are going to arise. There's still going to continue to be people who every day that the project can be delayed is actually beneficial for them. So they're going to look for ways that they can try and, do that. I think we thought so much about that during the procurement, so I think we've built in, and we've tried to mitigate that already as much as possible, but things are going to be unforeseen. So it's really establishing the communication. And I think it sounds cliche, but these projects become successful because public-private partnership isn't just a word, it really has to exist and it has to be there. And the partnership aspect is critical. It's critical. I mean, we already saw it, and I think it was very successful getting to commercial and financial close. It was really a successful process in the time frame that it was done. Getting through design, getting through construction, and then getting through, we're going to be partnered for 30 plus years, so getting through all of that, that's just the critical, and building that correctly, the foundations of it at the beginning is key.
Yep. Mr. Doctoroff.
I would simply echo, I think, what Nuria said, which is going forward, speaking from Michigan's perspective, we're going to be very active in this project because of all that we have to do pursuant to statements of activities and contractual obligations that necessitate our performing. And in order to, continue on with our success, past here has to be prologue. We have to make sure that those channels of communication remain unclogged, and there have to be many of them, so that things do not get lost, mistakes don't get made, assumptions don't become calcified, and the project gets more complicated, not less, through the performance phase in our perspective. And we just got to make sure that we maintain that communication infrastructure and trust to keep on getting the job done.
Just very briefly, there's not much more to say apart from the fact that, I totally agree that communication is the key, and one document that does include some of that communication is the project agreement that's already in existence. And so I would say that many tools that are in place are there to be used, but it needs to be made into a living document that reflects the thought that went in it, and also the fact that it would need to be interpreted in a way that was in the best interest of the project going forward. And we would expect that to occur, that people on both sides will look to the project agreement again as a robust framework, but something that also needs to become a living document that everyone fully understands and internalizes and looks at in its context. And there are the tools there for that to occur, including the necessary committees and so on.
So I think we've come full circle in that sense, that communication is
Key.
Is going to be key as we go forward. Now, we have some questions, but I've also been directed by members of various constituents not to drag this out. So let's try this one. What role did the change in political climate play? Who the hell's going to answer this? In creating or reducing challenges for the project, Andy?
Okay. Well, we live in the United States, and there's no political conflict there. So it's been wonderful from day one. But here's the truth. The political climate hasn't changed since this project began in any significant sense. We had one party, well, let me strike that. We had a governor who aggressively and tightly embraced this project. We had members of his own party that shied away from it. And we had supporters and stakeholders who remained constantly, close to the project and deeply supportive of it in the business community and in the labor community. And what we did is we worked with what we had. We knew that we had that support, and that was enough to allow the project to continue given the legal infrastructure that existed. We had to defend in court the crossing agreement, which was a product of a political environment. There would be no crossing agreement had we not gotten the obstruction of the Maroons or others at the time that it was written or just before that. So I would make the argument that the political climate was essentially frozen solid with some changes and variations in temperature in 2011, 2012. The team at Warner, the Governor's Council, Michigan's Council, we said, given that climate, what do we need to do in order to succeed? And what we did is we just plowed through all of the political obstacles that there were. It was a game of whack-a-mole again and again. We defeated the Maroons in court. We've still got a couple appeals that we have to win. We dealt with the legislative challenges as they arose. But the bottom line is, it goes to the same thing that everyone's been saying all along. Projects have challenges. In order to overcome those challenges that exist, we had to address them collaboratively, and we did. And you know what? We never really made this a political issue. I look at this project as operational and implementational, and that's what we did. We stayed quiet politically, and I think that we will always do so because there's no reason to speak up.
Just from a Canadian perspective, if I could, it's worth remembering that on the first visit by new Prime Minister Trudeau to the White House, an announcement was made by the White House about the Gordie Howe Bridge and the importance of it. So I think that reassured many people that there really wasn't any change even at that level that was going to impact. And it's, again, worth remembering that during the course of this process, certainly since the crossing agreement, there was a major change in government in Canada, where, obviously the government changed from the Conservative government to the Liberal government, and we didn't miss a beat. The support from Canada, from all the agencies of Canada, from the central agencies throughout, was constant and complete. And so I think we'd have to say that the changing political climate on both sides of the border, whether it's in the U.S. or Canada, had no impact on the project.
Sorry for interrupting. Let me just add to this. We have an election in Michigan tomorrow. And what we have done is to make sure that this project is legally, solid and intact, irrespective of who wins or what level of enthusiasm there might be. So we think that we have protected ourselves against any, realistic political contingency. Again, and that's part of the planning process, plan of the thinking. How do we protect this project no matter what, irrespective of what the climate is?
And I think Andy's point, we talked about it a bit earlier, that starts with the crossing agreement. And that's what allows you to have that whole framework that insulates you from this kind of thing.
Any thoughts, Nuria? Tariffs, we're okay?
I'm reading the time to wrap it up.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that's right. If I understand it, we stand between you and the cocktail party, so that's it, we're done.
Thanks
Thanks very
everyone.
much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.